Morning? Okay. Today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Chapter 4 from the Brew textbook. Last class, there's an exam. Hopefully everyone took the exam. Next time when we have an exam, it will be a proctored exam, and I will send out instructions on exactly what you'll need to do to take that exam. In general, you need to go to a proctoring center like the LEC, sign up for an appointment, but I'll send out all that information a couple weeks ahead of time. So. This week, of course, you have the second paper that's due, and the topics for the second paper include public goods, externalities, and positive externalities and negative externalities. Today, what we're going to do in Chapter 4 is we're going to talk about theory of positive externalities, and the clearest example of a positive externality that we're going to use is education. Now, we're going to talk about some other examples of positive externalities, but this one has the most importance in terms of like big policy issues, and that's the reason why we focus on that in focus on that in Chapter 4 of Brew. We're going to talk about federal education policy and then education specifically in the state of Mississippi, which cuts a little closer to home, obviously. So if you remember when we talked about the government and allocative efficiency, in general the story that we have is that markets are a good way of organizing production with the exception of the presence of what? What sorts of things will mess up markets being the best way of putting together the production of a particular good? Last class we talked about what as an example? Well, we talked about negative externalities just before that, but related to it, we talked about the example of pollution, right? So pollution is the case of a negative externality. So if you have the presence of a negative externality, what else would be possibly mess up the efficiency of the market? Public goods. And so the example that the textbook talked about with that was crime prevention. In this class, we talked about the possibility of controlling climate change as a public good, right? So if there's going to be global warming, then it has this public good nature to it in that everything that if I benefit from are not warming the Earth's temperature because now the sea levels aren't going to rise and all this sort of stuff, I can't be excluded from those benefits, and it's not divisible, and it's also it's not excludable, it's not rival, and it's not divisible as well. So it's public goods nature of controlling climate change. And then the final one we're going to talk about today is positive externalities. So negative externality, generally the market overallocates production towards that good. In other words, there's too much energy being produced using coal-fired power plants rather than some sort of cleaner energy. Likewise, and on the opposite side of that, public goods are generally underallocated by a market because you have the free rider problem. The free rider problem means that because I can't be excluded from getting the benefits of it, I'm not going to be willing to pay for that good on my own. And then likewise, with a positive externality, we also get the case of underallocation of resources towards that good. Specifically, there's not enough of that good being produced. So what are some examples of positive externalities then? So we think about negative externality. A really clear example is pollution. A positive externality or positive spillover is going to be something where if I buy the good, someone else benefits from it as well. Also known as a positive spillover or spillover benefit. Examples. What are some examples of positive spillovers? Vaccines, right? So one of the big ones, vaccines. So if you decide to get your immunization for measles, mumps, and rubella, or meningitis, which I don't know why it is, I don't understand the science of it, but for some reason it's like something about dorm living and being like really in close quarters where meningitis gets really bad, like bacterial meningitis gets really much more common on college campuses than anywhere else, and so that's why they've started recently requiring a meningitis vaccine for college students too, or like that's like the primary age group that where you have to get this. If you get vaccinated for viral or bacterial meningitis, then you're benefiting yourself because you're not going to get it, but then also you're not going to be a carrier of it and potentially get someone else sick, right? So do you guys know about pertussis, whooping cough? All right, so have you got someone that's had it? Small children, yeah.
Like if you have it, these things stay on small children because it can potentially kill them,
And what's been happening recently with pertussis and with measles?
Yeah, like they were extinct and now they're coming back.
And they're coming back, and why is that?
Because, well, I don't really know. It could be like a whole bunch of other things, like what you said with like the college dorm rooms and stuff. It's because large populations are living in such close quarters. Like, you got to think of like pre-New York, before sanitation and stuff. The reason why pre-New York was so bad was because there was a lot of people and not enough sanitation.
Right, so you have a lot of people interacting, and some people get sick, and other people don't have vaccinations, and therefore they're going to be spreading it quite a bit. So we had a big measles outbreak that was tied to where in California last year before maybe. Do you guys remember this? Disneyland, right?
Yeah.
Now, whenever I see something happening in California or Colorado, and Colorado and California are the two places where whooping cough has really come back really strongly, I think it's because they have a bunch of dirty hippies out there. And those dirty hippies stop vaccinating their kids because they think, oh, it's going to hurt them, it's medicine, it's modern or something. And so they can do that as long as they keep their kids away from everybody else and keep them in like a little log cabin up in the woods. But if you have your kid that's not vaccinated, that's then interacting with everybody else, then guess what? Then you're creating a health hazard, right? It's like Typhoid Mary. Do you guys know the story of Typhoid Mary? Right, so Typhoid Mary killed all these people because she was working in kitchens in the 1800s, and she was a carrier of typhoid, but she never got sick herself.
She was recessive.
Yeah, and so she just ended up getting everybody else sick. And the same thing can happen, because there's an incubation period with a lot of these diseases, so you may not be exhibiting symptoms, but you're still contagious. Right? So vaccines don't just help you, they also help everyone else around you as well. And so there's this positive externality from getting vaccinated. Now, the other example that I like to think about, because I live in a regular kind of neighborhood with lots of neighbors all around, is thinking like neighborhood beautification. Like if I decide to go out and plant nice trees, like I really like forsythia. Do you guys know what forsythia is? It's this yellow flowering bush that comes out in early spring. Like I love forsythia. If I decide to go out and plant forsythia, I benefit from it because I can look out in my front yard, but who else does as well?
Our neighbors.
Our neighbors, yeah. So they probably see it more often than I do even. So if I'm doing that, I'm spending money on it, but it's helping other people too. Like there's some benefit to it. And then finally, the example that we're going to talk a lot about today is education. Now, why is it that education has a spillover benefit or a positive externality? Yeah?
I was going to ask you, because from the text, would transportation be one of positive spillover benefits?
Yeah, that's a good question.
So how is transportation going to have a...
Not only like the issuing of driver's license and making sure these people know how to drive, for one, for two, also repairing roads,
Okay.
So I would say that's still on
And I missed it.
You missed it. And that's the most important thing, is that you missed it. Right. So the idea is just because someone provides it, though, could you privatize that? Yeah. You could privatize it. Okay. And like knowing how to drive, having that as a license is true. But if I'm a better driver, right, but it was in public transportation?
It just said transportation.
just like transportation, driving in general.
Driving in general.
Roads, like
I
that
know,
was like
meaning like public services or something like public transportation, school buses and stuff like that.
Okay.
Right, but you have places where these are privatized.
Well, some apartments do, especially like here.
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Oxford.
Yeah.
You could get private transportation. And do I benefit from someone else riding the bus?
No.
No. How would I benefit from that?
Not as much traffic.
Right? There might be some additional effect from that. That's true. Right? It'd be pretty minimal though. Right? Generally, we don't think about transportation as a good that has a positive spillover benefit. Right? Now, if you wanted to talk about investment, like is there social overhead capital that we could invest in? That's true. Right? But in general, and this is an example that actually the textbook uses, that transportation isn't seen as something that has necessarily positive spillover benefits. Right? So anytime you feel like you have a question about a test, feel free to ask me in class, but I do, not in the middle of another lecture. So that's cool. But I mean, I don't remember exactly how the question was worded, but I'd have to look at that and let you know specifically what the issue was. Okay? All right. But generally, we don't think of transportation. So like if you're driving a car, right, how am I benefiting from your driving the car? Or not driving the car, right? Transportation is a very general category. Public transportation as well is a fairly general category. But I'd have to think about the question more specifically, right? I don't have all the questions memorized right now. You guys know it more because you actually are annoyed by it, so that's fine. But seriously though, if you have a specific question, just go ahead and email me that, and I can look into it, right? Any other questions like that? All right, so let's talk about education and education policy. Now, the reason why education affects other people, you have to be very clear about pecuniary and non-pecuniary externalities. Okay. What does pecuniary mean? What does that have to do with? Not relevant. It's relevant to this specific class. So when you think about like economics, what do you think about? Money, right? So I mean, like before you took Econ 101, right, and learned the definition of economics, I think economics we're talking about money, right? So this has to do with monetized and non-monetized. So a pecuniary externality is an externality, but somehow the market has a mechanism to pay for it. So the idea here is that it works through the market system. So for example, if we wanted to think about a pecuniary externality, you could think about something like the city investing in social overhead capital, right? Where if the city invests in social overhead capital, then what are they going to try to attract? What's the whole idea behind it? So if they're trying to invest in bigger roads, so like 98 as a corridor, right? They invest, the state invested a lot of money to make that a 6-lane highway, with good shoulders and everything else. So what was the benefit from that?
More tourists, to get more tourist attraction.
Well, to get more tourist attraction, but also to just get more business along that corridor, right? So the idea is that you're making this investment, it's going to work through the market system, that what's going to happen when you build that road, what's going to happen to the land prices right around that road? They're going to go up, right? So it's going to be affected through the market system, right? That there's a market mechanism where if I'm sitting here, I'm going to get paid more for it. A non-pecuniary is an externality where you don't necessarily see a market interaction such that you're seeing a price mechanism at play. So there's no price mechanism or market that reflects the externality. So for example, is there any way that you can benefit from your fellow classmates getting their vaccines?
Yeah, you would be sick.
You won't be sick, but is there a market mechanism, right? Is there some sort of market out there, like you'll benefit from it from not being sick, but is that going to be reflected somehow in market behavior? I mean, maybe we could think of someone.
because with less people getting sick, less people buying to get medicine and stuff.
Right, but is that going to have an effect on the price of medicine, like locally at least? It's hard to think of the example of how that's going to happen,
Yeah.
right? But let's think about this in terms of distinguishing the positive externality with education. When we think about education, we think about who does it benefit, right? It's going to benefit you, right? So you're getting an education. Part of the idea of you're getting an education so you can earn more money, right? So you're going to try to get credentials so you can go get a job or go on and get a higher degree or something like that so that you can get a better job, right? And so that's going to benefit you. Who else might it benefit as well? It's going to benefit the world as a whole, and then we're going to argue that that's a non-pecuniary externality. But who's going to hire you, right? The company or the employer that's going to hire you, they're going to try to get the pecuniary externality out of that in that there's a market mechanism to recognize that I'm hiring higher skilled workers, so I'm going to be able to make more stuff, and I'm going to get more profit off of that, right? So there's an externality, but there's a market involved there because they're actually the ones that are paying you for that. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's a little bit different than the non-pecuniary externality, which might mean something like what's going to happen, what happens in towns where you have more educated people? How would you characterize a town that has like a lot of really well-educated people? Most people have their bachelor's degree, a lot of people have graduate degrees and such, versus one where practically no one is a high school graduate and everyone's like, a lot of people are 8th grade dropouts and all that sort of stuff. What sorts of characteristics would you expect to have going on in the two?
Would it be the funding that the governments are given?
Well, the funding that the governments are given is going to be through right, it's going to be more like there's going to be a monetary transfer there. What else is going on?
Maybe their parents are uneducated themselves.
Right, so there's going to be something going on with families. But in general, what do you expect to happen to the crime rate in the high-educated city versus the low-educated city? The lower-educated city is going to have a much higher crime rate, right? You're going to have less investment in like not public services like transportation stuff, but you're going to have lower investment in things like community projects, right? You're going to have less kind of community spirit and things that are non-market based. So all that stuff is non-pecuniary. Likewise, what's going to happen in a place where if you're a worker and you go to work in a town that has a lot of really well-educated people, what's going to happen to your productivity? What happens if you're in a classroom and everyone else has read the material ahead of time and they're going to be able to contribute to that? Are you going to get more or less out of the class than if people are like, no one's read it all that day? You're going to get a lot more out of it. But there's no market mechanism where you can show that you're benefiting from that.
Okay.
So there's a non-pecuniary externality to education where everybody benefits from the fact that there's more knowledge out there, but there's also a pecuniary externality. And it's somewhat useful to keep in mind that there are these two different things. So for education, we want to focus on the non-pecuniary externalities, which include things like that it's just a nicer place to live, that there is, that you're going to benefit from it in your own work, that there's maybe creation of knowledge that's not going to be completely captured by the company that does so, right? So Apple, right? What sorts of products kind of have come out of Apple in the last 25 years? So the Apple Watch, the iPhone, the iPod before that, your MacBooks, they keep on innovating in these sorts of consumer electronics. Now, have they benefited from that in terms of their profits? Has there been additional societal benefit beyond what they've been able to earn in profits? Yeah. So consumers would be willing to pay even more oftentimes than what they have to pay for a lot of these gadgets, and it's benefited them even more. And if you think about things like the advanced technology that go into things like GPS systems and all that sort of stuff, and just the dissemination of this information, that people have figured out ways of making money off of existing technologies, that if those technologies didn't exist, then they wouldn't have been able to be entrepreneurs themselves. So being able to build upon this sort of stuff in a way that isn't necessarily always captured in the market. So let's talk about education policy then in the United States. So if we have these non-pecuniary externalities that exist for education, then there's a role for the government to play in actually supporting education. Now, one quick modeling of any kind of externality has to do with thinking about what is the social optimal versus what ends up happening in the market. So if we have price in terms of dollars per year of schooling on the Y, and we have years of schooling in the aggregate on the X, right? We have the market for education. We have the demand for the private demand for education, which is related to the individual benefiting from it, right? Again, you guys are getting more schooling, you're in college, you're maybe thinking about graduate school or some additional training beyond this, partially because you get some specific benefit from it. That's why you have a demand curve for schooling. Likewise, there's a supply of schooling that's upward sloping. But just like the case of the negative externality, instead of just having private actors in here, we also have society, and there's a social demand for education. And that social demand includes both the private demand that's captured by this original curve and the external benefit or the external demand. And so it captures both the private and the external, which gives us the entire society's demand. Now, where is the market equilibrium in this graph?
Would it cross?
So which two cross? So the supply curve and the social demand gives us where we want to be, but in terms of the overall market, that's just going to be where the private does. Like if there's no government involvement and you just have to pay for your schooling, there's no one else who's going to, there's not going to be public subsidies, there's not going to be Pell Grants, there's not going to be anything else. That would only happen at this point right here where we get Q market, right? Because then it would just be the private demand and the private supply. So QM gives us what the private market would give us without any additional government support, right? However, is that the most efficient point? Is that where we want to be in terms of allocative efficiency? What do you think, Nicholas?
I would assume somewhere between social demand and the demand curve.
It's going to be somewhere else, right? And the way to think about this is that this captures all of the benefits to society, right? Then the marginal benefit of one more year of schooling at QM is all the way up here, and the marginal cost is all the way down there. Which means that if we produce one more year of schooling, is society better off than it would be at QM? Yeah, because the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. And that keeps on being true up until that point right there. So that is the efficient level of schooling. Given the fact that the efficient level of schooling is to the right of the market level, what can we say about what the market does? Does the market allocate properly? Does it underallocate, or does it overallocate resources to the production of schooling? Given where QE is compared to QM. It underallocates. It underallocates resources towards schooling because at the market equilibrium, the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. So we would want to produce more schooling than what the private market would do by itself. Okay? Thus, we have an economic argument based upon efficiency of why the government should get involved in the education game. Right? So how do we actually go about doing so? What are some of the policies that we have in terms of education in the United States? Just in general, like How did most of you guys get to K through 12 education?
We have public and private schools.
You have there's a public school system, which means that the government is basically subsidizing entirely that K through 12 education, right? So it subsidizes it through the allocation, through the collection of taxes, but there's no tuition. So you, up until 12th grade, you didn't have to pay anything for your school if you chose to go to the public school system, right? There's also a private school system, which is separate. What about after you go through K through 12? You still get student loans, and how are those subsidized by the government?
Interest rate you get done.
Yeah, so they pay your interest until you get done, and they also help guarantee them, and so you're paying a lower interest rate than if you're out on the private market too. So those are two ways that they try to encourage some additional schooling beyond K through 12. What else? In addition to student loans, if you qualify, what else do you get? Pell Grants as well. That's right. And in addition to that, what's true about your tuition here compared to a place like Millsaps?
What's cheaper?
It's definitely going to be cheaper, right? So we get about a third of our budget, and it's a little less than that now. It used to be about a third of our budget from the state directly. We got a third of it from tuition, a third of it from the state, and about a third of it from grants, right? So all these different ways, the government is trying to provide additional resources to get us closer to the socially optimal level. Now, if you just want to think about the external benefits of having educated population, where would you focus most of your resources? Would you focus most of it on higher education or K through 12 in terms of getting the biggest bang for the buck?
Probably K through 12.
K through 12, right. So the idea is that like having a few people with college degrees or master's degrees or PhDs, they benefit society overall. But who mostly gets the benefit of your college education? Who mostly gets that benefit? You do, right? You get that benefit. So most of the cost still should be borne by the individual because they're the ones getting the benefit. K through 12, though, if you have a society of people that are illiterate, that don't have basic numeracy skills, then you're not going to have a very good functioning government, right? Because you're not going to have a you're not going to have a citizenry that can decide on these issues to elect the right people, and you're going to have really bad decisions being made from our democratic system. Now, there are people that might contend that even in our current education system, we still get those things, but nonetheless, it'd be even worse. I have a feeling it'd be even worse. So for those reasons, you really should focus on K through 12. A lot of developing countries have it screwed up where they spend a lot more money on their tertiary schooling than they do on their K through 12, and that just kind of has everything upside down in terms of the economic argument for it, both in terms of efficiency and equity. Now, what do we see in terms of federal education policy? Well, the biggest policy in the past 15 years has been No Child Left Behind. Now, what was the goal of No Child Left Behind?
Keep people moving through the grade.
Moving to the grades. What's that?
They were trying to pass it.
Well, why did they want people to pass these tests?
To know if they were ready to go ahead and move on to go ahead and continue.
Right, because what was the issue beforehand?
It was,
Here now, still, yeah,
What's that?
a lot of kids.
Yeah, but how did we know they were even failing?
The cumulative test.
The what?
state test, yeah.
The state test didn't exist before No Child Left Behind. So the state test came about because of No Child Left Behind. So the problem was that up until No Child Left Behind, there was no way to keep individual school districts accountable to all the parents, all the children that were out there, because if the school district saw it in their own best interest, they could socially promote kids and just pass them through the grades, even though they didn't know the material, right? And so the idea behind No Child Left Behind was, first of all, to create greater accountability for schools. Accountability was the name of the game, is that there was going to be testing, and if schools weren't clearly educating those kids, then they were going to get some sort of penalty for not doing so. And there's big time incentives to make sure that school districts were in fact educating kids. The other thing is that they provided greater flexibility for students. So if you had a kid in a school that wasn't performing up to snuff, you could move them without any kind of financial penalty to another school depending upon how it was set up. So for example, my kids went to the local elementary schools here, and one year their school got an increase in the population by about 15%, just because one of the elementary schools hadn't met their adequate yearly progress 2 years in a row. And so they told them, look, you can go to any school in the district. Here's our highest performing school. And if you want to ship your kids over there, we'll pay for the buses and everything, not to take them to their local school, but take them to this other neighborhood school, right? And that was because of No Child Left Behind, that they had to give the parents the flexibility to choose a different school within the district. What they also did is that they tried to emphasize teaching methods proven to work. Now, the way that all this stuff was done is that on grades 3 through 8, there's yearly testing. And then in 9 through 12, they basically had to pass subject area tests. And so in Mississippi, what was this?
MCT.
That was your MCT and your MCT2, right? And so you were doing those every year, and then you had your subject area tests in high school. So you had your biology, algebra, U.S. history. What else? English as well, right? So those are your 4 subject area tests. Now, what was the problem with this system that was created during this time? So what were some of the weaknesses of No Child Left Behind? Students still weren't passing, right? But before, you didn't even know whether or not they were passing, right? So that was an even bigger issue. But you had a lot of kids that weren't passing these subject area tests, and so a lot of resources were going into trying to get those kids to pass those subject area tests so they could graduate. Eventually, they developed a system where no longer did they have to keep their feet to the fire, but oftentimes, what was the incentive for the school district to do then? If you had a really good chemistry teacher, what would you try to get them to do? Tutor, and also not teach chemistry, but teach biology, because guess what? Chemistry wasn't actually tested. So no one cared whether or not anyone was learning chemistry at your school. They only cared about biology because biology was the one that was being tested. Algebra 2 didn't matter. Only algebra mattered. Geometry didn't matter. Only algebra mattered. So you take your best teachers and you get them to teach those subject areas that you're going to be tested on. Because otherwise, then you're going to start getting in trouble with the feds and the state. Right? So not only that, but what started happening with MCT and the MCT2? You guys like that when you were going through that system? No, why not? You did it every year, right? And what's that, Amber?
A lot of stress on the students.
A lot of stress on the students, right? Stress on the teachers too. But part of it was that there's so much time spent to just preparing for the test that anything that wasn't going to be covered on the test was ignored, right? So things like critical thinking and writing skills, unless you happen to be in that 1 year where they're testing your writing, those things weren't covered either, right? So there's a lot of focus on the test and not the holistic approaches to education. So as a response to this, to these criticisms, the new approach, starting in 2012 to 2013, states could get waivers as long as they had a system for college and career readiness. And so they would develop they could develop their own system to show that they were preparing kids to be ready to go out there and either go to college or be able to start a career. Now, the feds said, look, here's some guidelines that we think you would need to meet to be able to show college and career readiness. And what did those guidelines start being called?
Common Core.
Common Core, right. So this became the system of Common Core. Because each state didn't want to create things from scratch, right? They wanted to say, well, do you have a template that we can start using and basically take it out of the box and just run with it ourselves so we don't have to do what we used to be doing? And they did. And they said, okay, this is Common Core. If you want to adopt this, then go with it. And therefore, states started adopting it. Now, it wasn't until states started adopting it, then everyone started backlashing and then start saying, oh, no, we're opting out of Common Core. We're going to do something else to get college and career readiness, but we're not going to call it Common Core. It's going to look a lot like Common Core, but we're not going to call it Common Core because people have a problem with Common Core. Now, did any of you guys do Common Core? No, my kids have barely seen it because largely, what is it, about 3 years ago, I guess, they started training teachers to get ready for this. And right now, they're still kind of developing the new testing system and everything else. But the whole idea is that it's supposed to be more focused on critical thinking, less on like specifically teaching to the test. That's supposed to be more holistic in some ways. So there's more project-based learning and all that sort of stuff in order to get kids ready in this other way. Now, this is something that federal education policy has been using to try to encourage kids in school districts to improve their standards. Now, one of the interesting things is that if you look at the overall level of testing abilities of U.S. kids, is that basically between 2001 and about 2005 or 2006, it improved more than it had in the previous 20 years. So there did seem to be this substantial gain, and specifically started helping really poor school districts. Because, most of you guys, you may not have loved your schools, and I know, like, when I was growing up, I didn't think my school was great, and I have a lot of complaints about my kids' schools and such. But generally, most kids, unless they're from the worst small town in the worst areas of the state, generally, you guys went to better schools than a lot of kids do in this state. I know they're... I'm not going to name areas, but if you start looking through the state education databases, you can see the schools where only 10 or 15% of the kids were passing their subject area tests, right? And those schools exist out there. Most of them aren't places that end up sending a lot of kids to college. Now, what about Mississippi? Oh, I wanted to talk about something else first. So beyond those federal controls, we have also 3 policy innovations. And part of the complaint about the way schools are currently run is that there's not enough innovation that happens inside schools. And so what they say is that there's just not enough competition in order to improve the quality of schools. So there are 3 kind of pro-competitive ways of going about this. The first one is not waivers. I'm not thinking of the right term here. These are charter schools. Magnet schools. And vouchers. So what's a charter school?
It's like a private prison.
It's like a private prison. So who's it funded by? It's still funded by the public sector. So it's public money, but run by a private entity. So they basically take the same tax dollars that go into public schools, but they have their own separate charter that they function under, so they don't have to abide by all the rules of the local school district. So they say, here's our charter. We're basically getting licensed by the state as a private entity to provide education in a very particular way. We have a very specific policy of doing so, but we're going to use public money to do so. Now, in 2013, we passed a charter school law here in the state of Mississippi, and right now there are 2 functioning charter schools, both in the Jackson area. One's for 5th grade only, and one's 5th and 6th grade. So it's really at its nascent stage here in the state of Mississippi. There have been charter schools in other states for 15, 20 years or more. The evidence on charter schools is a little bit tricky. Do they perform better than the local public schools in general? They do in general, but why do they perform better? Do they have to allow anyone who shows up at their door in the school? No. They can do what's known as cream skimming, which is they only allow the better kids into their school, so guess what? Their test scores look better. You know, are they actually producing something better? Sometimes it's hard to tell. Sometimes there is actually better innovation, like they're using better teaching methods or something like that, but it's not always clear. How about magnet schools? These are public schools that focus on a particular not discipline, but field. Excellent.
So is that like a middle school for like autism and Asperger people?
You know what's funny is like I think that's actually a private entity, isn't it? Like the 3D school or whatever it was.
I don't know. I don't know if Petal funds that or if it's a private thing. Or I don't know
Yeah.
how it works at all.
At first, I thought it was a private thing. They might be able to get some state funding because they have like loosened up some of these rules now, but I think it's still mostly private.
Magnet schools like Forest County HS.
No, that's actually just a regular public school.
Really?
Yeah, so it just happens to be like when they established the public school system, they just designated certain areas to be like focus on ag because of their location. And so I think there are like 3 or 4 ag schools throughout the state, and it just happens to be Forest County Ag. This is more like Jackson Math and Science, and also MSMS, and Mississippi School for the Arts. So that's a magnet school. So you take kids and you select them based upon showing particular proclivity in a field, and then you focus your whole curriculum towards that field. Right.
Magnolia School of Cosmetology, like just hair cutting, but you're preparing people to just go cut hair.
But is that K through 12 or is that?
No, that's like.
Yeah, that's like tertiary. Yeah. So this was in the K through 12 system, right?
So like a VOTEC then, like an auto mechanic class or like an electrician class or something like that.
But it has to be an entire school for this. But you know, they do have magnet schools that are more VOTEC oriented. And the thing is that, like I was reading a couple articles, this is a couple years ago, but like in the Chicago area where they have like, it's like a math and science school, but it's not like so people go off to college. It's actually more like so they can go work specifically in those kind of technical fields right away.
Okay.
Right, and so they actually have like funding from Ford and different things, and so they're actually working with like engineers like at their kind of VOTEC school, but it's a math and science school that's targeted towards people that are going to go directly into career. So MSMS and Mississippi School for the Arts are examples of these. And voucher system, do you guys know about those? These have been around for about 30 years. They started, the biggest one was in the city of Milwaukee. And basically, you can use public money for private school. So if every kid gets, let's say, $6,000 spent per year on, like their share of the public expenditure is about $6,000, they basically get a voucher, like a coupon for $6,000, and instead of using it for the public school, they can take it to a private school and they can pay their tuition at a private school with that, right? And so the idea is that you're decreasing the monopoly that the local school district has by allowing kids some additional choice. Milton Friedman was a big supporter of this, and like the first time I read about it was in this book, Free to Choose, which is kind of this like very layman's approach to understanding like how the importance of competition. But that's what a voucher system does.
Make the private school tuition go up?
It's not.
Or do they have to accept that voucher for that student?
They don't necessarily even have to accept that voucher, right? But the question is like, well, if someone's going to be showing up at your door, with cash, and it's generally not so big that it's going to like actually create a higher demand for those slots.
I know PCS spends less money per student than like Hattiesburg, and like they get. So I guess it could work out.
It could work out, and why Sacred Heart and PCS do that? Because one, they don't need certified teachers, and two, like Sacred Heart uses a lot of retired teachers, right? So teachers are getting paid their retirement from the state, and then they can go get a retirement job because you could get retirement after 25 years. So think you finish your degree at 22, you work in the public school system for 25 years, you get your full retirement, you're 47 years old, and you can go and get another job teaching. Not a bad deal, right? So there are a lot of teachers at Sacred Heart that actually have retired from the Hattiesburg system. And you don't have to pay them as much if you're at the private school, right? Because you don't have to pay their retirement because they're already drawing retirement, and you can pay them a lower wage because they're already drawing their retirement checks, right? But it could work out because actually tuition in places like Sacred Heart and PCS isn't that high. Like it's not like I know private schools like in Ohio and stuff where it's $25,000, $30,000 a year. Like I know a friend of mine has her twin boys that are 4th or 5th grade now that are going to a school in Brooklyn, and it's $25,000 a year for like 5th grade tuition, and it's going to jump up another third next year. Like they just got a tuition increase.
Jackson Co's pretty expensive.
Is that one pretty expensive?
13,000, 14,000.
Yeah.
But PCS is like 5,000.
Yeah, it's not really that much at all. So these are some policy innovations that people have tried in order to improve outcomes as well. Normally they're done on a very local basis. Like I said, in charter school, Mississippi just started a charter system recently. Let's talk a little bit about Mississippi education. All right, so if we wanted to talk about quality, there's lots of different ways of measuring quality. Where would you put Mississippi in terms of its K through 12 education system? Pretty high or pretty low?
Depends on what school.
Where I came from is pretty high.
Let's average across the entire United States.
In the middle.
In the middle? All right. So let's take average ACT scores. In Mississippi, it's 19. In the U.S. overall, it's 21. And Mississippi ranks 49th. Take about any measure of educational outcomes, Mississippi's going to rank in the bottom 5. Yeah. Now, why is that? Like
Rural school districts.
rural, you get rural, yeah. So, what else distinguishes Mississippi in terms of socioeconomic?
It's the poorest.
It's the poorest state, right? Poverty and education are positively correlated or negatively correlated, right? The more poverty you have, generally the lower educational outcomes. Now, part of that has to do with a couple of simple things. First of all, a lot of learning that goes on happens inside households, not inside of classrooms, right? So kids from more affluent households are generally much more prepared for K through 12 as well as college than kids from poorer households. Kids from poorer households don't get as much reading. They aren't read to as much. If you go, like I'll go to Walmart at 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, and invariably if I go there 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, or if I go there, 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night, I'll see, elementary school age kids there with their parents. Why? Because they have no other time, the parents have no other time to get the shopping done, and so they're waking up their kids. What happens with sleep deprivation? Cameron, do you learn very well with sleep deprivation? The answer would be no. Right? Generally, the mind cannot absorb material as well when it's deprived of sleep. And so if you have kids from backgrounds, I would want you to poke him or something, but I don't know. I was a kid that slept a lot in class too, so yeah. You're right there. Yeah. Generally, if parents don't have the resources to make sure that the kids are going to get their 8 to 10 hours of sleep every night, that they're not going to get their 3 good meals, all these sorts of things, then they're not going to be as prepared to learn while they're in the classroom. Likewise, they're not kids from poorer households. Like if you take kids from 6 weeks after birth, right? They've done these tests on very basic cognitive tests. 6 weeks after birth, there's no difference between a kid born in a poor household and one that's born in an affluent household. If you take those kids then a year later, there's already a difference because of the difference in environment. And so the more poverty you have, the lower educational outcomes you're going to have, right? But we also have some differences in our system. What about kindergarten? Know anything about kindergarten in Mississippi? It's not mandatory even. You don't have to send your kid to kindergarten in the state of Mississippi. Legal age, first grade is first grade. If you've ever talked to a first grade teacher, what are they supposed to learn in first grade? What's the number one priority for a first grade teacher? How to read, right? Think about the difference between a kid that's been in a household where they've been read to and they've been shown letters and they've had all this kind of pre-reading skills done, and then they start in kindergarten and they're doing all of that stuff, and then they're ready to read if they're not already reading by the beginning of first grade. Someone whose first time they've stepped into a classroom or have been read to significantly is when they get into first grade, it's going to be a lot more work. And that kid's going to be behind every single year, right? And so some of this stuff is tied to the socioeconomic status. However, we also have some stuff that's tied to the way that we fund our schools, right? So I was talking about the overall, funding level per state. So in Mississippi, in 2006, expenditure per pupil was $7,221. By 2013, it had grown to $81.30, right? So it's getting better, right? So over 7 years, it is increasing. It's increasing at a pretty good rate, right? That we are spending more money on education. But compare that to Delaware in 2013, $13,833. Right? Where there's just more resources, about 70% more resources being spent per pupil in education in the state of Delaware. Connecticut and Massachusetts, even higher, right? Where does Delaware rank in those ACT scores? They end up being 4th, right? With an average of 23.5 average ACT score in Delaware. All right. Money can't solve all the problems of K through 12 education, but lack of money won't solve any problems, right? And that is one of the problems that we have in Mississippi, that we underfund our schools. Now, there are lots of people that claim that public schools can be more efficient, etc. I don't know. If you guys spend time at Hattiesburg High or you spend time in some of these smaller school districts around, you wouldn't be able to say that really there's a lot of extra stuff around, right? It's just simply not happening. Schools, the salaries are lower for teachers, but part of the problem too is who is teaching the kids in Mississippi? Where did they go to school? Mississippi, right? And so if they weren't getting a very good education when they were going through K through 12, and then they go off to college, fine. But then college teachers only have the resources that they can deal with as well. Who's going into K through 12 education in general? Is it the people that are at the very top of the class? No, not generally. As a matter of fact, that 19 average of ACT for graduates from high school, right, that's our average for kids that go on into education programs too. So the average education major is only an average high school graduate. not above average. And so that's going to be causing a problem as well. And so you have this feedback loop where you have substandard K through 12 education, which means that those kids that are not fully prepared when they go off to college, which means you're still not even preparing them to go back and become teachers. Not an easy problem to solve. Now there was a proposition, there was an initiative that tried to address some of these issues. Some of these issues. You guys remember this from the fall? So Proposition 42 was to Mississippi adequate education program. Well, that's definitely how the people that didn't like it were spinning it, right? And the idea was that the legislature right now gets to decide appropriations entirely. What this would have allowed is that if people said, look, we have this formula that says how much each school district is supposed to get. Since this was passed about 15 years ago, we've only adequately funded education twice, right? So the legislature passed this rule saying this is how much school districts should get, and only twice have they been able to support this. And so the idea was behind Proposition 42 is that if your kid was going to a school district where they weren't getting that proportion that they're supposed to be getting according to the state law, then you could sue in order to increase funding. Lots of political stuff going on with that, but what ended up happening is that Phil Bryant and the state lawmakers basically threatened all other state agencies and said, if this passes, we're going to cut your budgets. Okay? So Rodney Bennett and other people that were in charge of state institutions said, this is the reality. If this passes, we're going to cut our budget by 7.9%. Ended up not getting passed, right? It was pretty close, but it ended up not getting passed. So what's happening right now? Budgets are still getting cut, even though it didn't pass. Now, the reason why budgets are getting cut is because we've lost about $300 million because of tax cuts that have come about in the first 4 years of Governor Bryant's term. The claim is that eventually this will grow the economy and grow tax revenues. It just hasn't happened yet. So right now, the USM and all state agencies are facing a 1.5% budget clawback mid-year. So we have to give back about 1.5% of our budget back to the state. Yeah. All right. K through 12 is being affected by that too. All right. That's all I have. Have a good one. I'll be posting the next quiz on Friday. It'll be due on Monday.